nearly 3 years, Syria's children have watched the world around them collapse. They've seen shells falling. Streets have become battlefields, and childhoods have been lost.
Another coffin, another child. So many children are paying a price in this war.
الأزاز تكسر والشبابيك وقعوا والابواب صارت قطعة. أتحرك صارت حد إجري قاعد عتجري حد إجري إيش حد إجري وأنا نطيت خفت كتير خفت أنا في يعني.
Syria's children are experiencing one of the worst humanitarian disasters of recent times.
The situation in Syria is terrible. Schools are closed down, food is running out, water is making people very, very sick because it's dirty, because the sanitation system has broken down.
And there is no sign of it ending. We all agree that something needs to be done. But what can we actually do?
Justin Forsyth, let me come to you first of all. You say that children are bearing the brunt of this. In what way?
They're being killed, they're being wounded, they're being traumatized by the terrible conflict that's going on in Syria, but also many of the refugees in neighboring countries in Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq now are also suffering. Winter is coming on. Many are out of school. Many are suffering in many ways because of the things they've seen. I remember I was up on the very north of Lebanon a few months ago and meeting children who had literally just come across the border, and I met a little boy who I'll never forget, called Majed, who was 13. And he told me his story, and it's the individual stories of children, I think, that stick in your mind. He had been in his street, and a tank had rolled into the street, and in a split second had opened fire with its machine gun on the turret. I think he said 15 people, neighbors, even some of his friends, were killed. And the following day, all the survivors in his area had gone to the funeral, and he'd gone with his best friend to bury the 15, some of his neighbors. And a sniper, this is a little boy who's 13, and his best friend, who I think was only 12, was shot, his best friend was shot through the back, and the little boy Majed described, which you don't really imagine. I could never imagine actually seeing this in real life, but a little boy of 13 describing it to you, how a bullet went through his back and how out of his stomach all of the blood exploded, and how his father picked up his best friend and literally ran down the street with this boy in his arms into his house. Obviously, he was already dead. And this little boy then had fled with his family and then would come across the border into northern Lebanon. And organizations like Save the Children, but many others, were helping little boys like Majed overcome the trauma to get back to school. But it will take years and years, maybe never, for those little children to overcome what they've seen and heard. And he's just one of millions of children. And he's a lucky one now, because there are 2.5 million people in Syria who don't even have any access to aid. And I think, I started my career working on humanitarian issues, as you mentioned, with Oxfam. Actually, before that, I worked on South Africa. And I think of all the different things I've seen all in the last 25 years, there have been ones that have been worse than this. Rwanda was worse. It was a genocide. But since then, I don't think we've ever seen something so bad in terms of the targeting of children. And I asked a child, this is a final point, John, why they were targeting the children, why so many children were being shot. And he said that when they asked the soldiers this, it was because they said, you are the future. And I think that's what the chilling nature of what this conflict has become.
So what is the challenge for you, for Save the Children, to protect these very vulnerable children? What is the greatest challenge that you face in making their protection become a reality?
I think the most important and the first priority must be to stop the war. And that's beyond any of the humanitarian organisations. And there are people on the panel tonight who are more experienced to speak about that. But I think after that, what we must make sure that even as the war goes on, even before we stop it, that we get access to everyone in need, that we provide protection. The Security Council, actually a week after it passed its resolution, a few weeks after the resolution on chemical weapons, passed a statement about humanitarian access. But what we've seen is very little progress since then. We've had chemical weapons inspectors cross conflict lines. One friend of mine, an aid worker, told me it made him weep when he saw these chemical weapons inspectors cross the conflict line because he'd been trying to negotiate for nearly a year to get aid into the same communities. So the first thing we must do, even in the midst of this conflict, we must make sure that we get aid to people in need. And the international community surely can come together. Even if it can't agree anything else, surely it can come together to ensure that aid gets to every child, every family in Syria that needs it.
I just want to ask you a quick final question. What are the consequences of inaction?
I think, as you actually mentioned in your introduction, a whole lost generation. These are children that have seen and witnessed. Some of them have been killed themselves. Some of them have even been tortured. I've met many children that have been tortured themselves. But this is a lost generation unless we help them, unless we stop the war, but we also help them in the midst of the war overcome their trauma, go to school, have access to basic food and water. For me, it's more than humanitarian aid. This is solidarity. Are we going to stand with the people of Syria? Are we going to stand with the families of Syria, the children of Syria? This feels to me this is the biggest calling of our generation. Are we going to stand up as an international community to make sure that Majed isn't left alone, that we stand with those children? And, I always said, in different jobs in my life, would we have when I had a position of influence, and running Save the Children, you have a little bit of influence, whether we would step up when there was a big thing going on. We didn't in Rwanda, did we, Mark? The world left Rwanda. So is the world going to stand up for the children of Syria? That is, I think, the big question.
Okay, Paul, let me come to you now. I think it's a year since you were injured and you had
about
that...
16 months.
16 months, yeah. And you had that tortuous journey out and Marie died, sadly. How are you doing?
Not too bad, remarkably. In fact, the leg wounds healed up. I can walk in straight lines. If I go too far, I tend to veer left. I can't run backwards with a camera, so that stops me going back. But no, physically, and I think probably mentally, I'm more or less back to where I was.
And mentally, how big a toll did it take on you?
Quite a huge one. Losing Marie and Remy in the situation that we did was obviously devastating. But I think, in reality, I can deal with that. Marie died doing a job she loved. It wasn't a job, it was her life, it was her passion. And as Richard, her partner, said, she'd have made a lousy old lady. So that side, but the part that sticks with me most is, you take a look at that photograph.
Just talk us through this photograph.
Yeah, we'd been in Baba Amra during what I can only describe as a medieval siege. There was the 4th Division had surrounded a tiny neighbourhood, a few kilometres squared really, and were just pounding it with heavy artillery, Grad rockets, Katyusha rockets, 80mm mortars. Every munition you can imagine was fired randomly on that city for all of the time I was there. This was the end result. This was a former woodworking shop. It was one of 2 basements in the neighbourhood of Baba Amra, and it was kind of rightly known as the widow's basement. This was where the people who'd lost all their husband, the men folk, were taken with the children, put down inside in the hope that they didn't get a direct hit, because believe me, that isn't a bomb shelter. That is a woodworking shop that housed hundreds of people.
Okay, I think we've got another photo that we can bring up on the screen now.
This was the day me and Marie were in the field clinic in Baba Amra. What you've got to understand is that the regime had a priority list of targets at this point in the conflict. Doctors and medical staff were number one on that list. They worked on the theory that if no help could be provided to anybody, they would somehow keep the rebels down. They would stop any kind of action happening. And this is a mother who's just come in and found her son. He'd been shot through the back, shot through the leg, and she'd just walked into the room, found him, and half an hour later he died. He passed away.
Paul, I just want you to talk me through almost the mechanics, the logistics of being a journalist in Syria today, the dangers that you're facing, the problems of filing your reports.
Yeah, I mean, it's by far and away the worst conflict I've ever covered. When me and Marie did Libya, we kind of sneaked in, or went through a border crossing to Egypt and went straight into rebel-controlled areas. When we did cross into Syria this time, we had to go across the mountains from Lebanon with gun runners and smugglers to get us in. We went through a minefield on a motorbike, which was interesting, because they said they'd found all the mines and marked them. However, the little sticks that they'd marked them with had been washed away. So we weaved our way in, and that was just getting into the country. Once you were in Syria, the government had completely locked down everywhere. We could travel for maybe half a kilometre at a time, and it took us, 4 or 5 days to get 30 kilometres. Then to get in, the city of Homs was besieged, and I mean, seriously, they'd dug trenches around it, ringed it in steel, and they had such a vast amount of ammunition that they could afford to sit there for 18 hours a day hammering a civilian neighbourhood. To get in there, we had to go through a 3-kilometre long sewer tunnel storm drain that was about 4 foot high. And that storm drain was the sole lifeline for Baba Amra. That provided all sacks of flour, grain. That was the only way in, and that's the way the journalists had to go in. Once there, we were... Sorry, I'm rabbiting.
No, you're not rabbiting at all. I suppose the question I want to ask is, and this is a question, as any reporter who's been out in the field knows, that you ring the news desk, and there are times when you ring the news desk and they want to bite your arm off. They're so desperate to get pictures. They're so desperate to get copy. In my case, they want you live from the scene. If you were able to walk backwards with a camera now and you were in Syria today, how good do the pictures have to be to get in the paper? Because it does seem to be slipping down the agenda.
It's fatigue. I think, is a general fatigue. We've gone through Iraq, we've gone through Afghanistan, we went through Libya, which kind of fitted a kind of perverse little slot, really. It had a beginning, middle, end. People could watch it. It kept the interest up. With Syria, after nigh on 3 years, there's that awful kind of fall over the cliff of news where something really horrendous has to happen to get it back on top of the news. I don't think, to be honest, there is, people are not sending journalists to Syria now. As you know, I think most big organisations have actually stopped sending people in, A, because of the dangers, but B, I can't think of a single photograph that I could take in Syria at this point in time that would have any effect on people's awareness. That there is so much there. Journalists have gone in and showed the world exactly what's happening, and the world has closed its eyes, turned around, scratched its arse, and done something else. There has been a disgusting degree of negligence when it comes to the Syrian conflict.
Michael, let me come to you, because, we know what the level of awareness, the level of engagement is here in Britain and probably in Europe. I just wonder, in Russia, and maybe outside Moscow and St. Petersburg, what level of interest you will find among ordinary Russian people about what is unfolding in Syria?
Well, as a matter of fact, I would say that Russians quite indifferent to foreign policy in general. In fact, Ukraine, for instance, right now, that is in the focus of attention, but not for many attention to other events, and Syria in particular. Or as you have correctly mentioned, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and a few other big towns, that's where people just permanently in the internet, and they follow all developments, and they're not indifferent to what is going on outside Russia. For them, of course, that is interesting, and it's important to understand how just even Russian government performs there. And before, let's say a few months ago, we can remember what the position of Mr. Putin was at that time.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, because I covered the G20 summit in St. Petersburg when it seemed that relations between Putin and Obama in the West were at an all-time low. Action seemed imminent against Syria. Since when there has been a deal done over Iran, which is, where America and Russia were working closely together. There's been the chemical weapons agreement. How far do you think Russia is prepared to go to try to deliver maybe a change of regime that could bring peace to the country?
You're touching the very sensitive point. In fact, motivations of Russian authorities and Mr. Putin in particular is a little bit different compared with the foreign, European politicians. Mostly they care about their own, how they're viewed by others, whether strong enough or not. And they understand the legitimacy of them is very low. That's why when you don't have legitimacy inside the country, you try to draw your legitimacy outside. That's why Putin desperately needs respect by foreign leaders. That's why Syria is appeared to be in this game an important point. And that's why when Obama started to a certain extent more flexible vis-a-vis on Syria aspects, on Syria issue, that's why some kind of deal appeared to be. Of course, we welcome just the peaceful resolution of the problem, especially pressure on Assad to recognize that chemical weapons in place and just to join the organization and sign the International Treaty of Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But as we in Russia say, you build up the trust, but check every time. We'll see what happens. The international community and the inspectors announced that for destroyment of chemical weapons in Syria would be necessary only just half a year. But people and experts know just Syria, Assad has 1,000 tons. And other people say it's not possible to destroy during this period of time. It means all these weapons should be delivered somewhere else. Who in the world has these facilities? The United States and Russia in particular. Nobody is saying how the whole process will go through. That's why I'm saying just better to check. That's why I welcome what development is taking place, but I doubt about the real, I would say, intentions, especially just having in mind that killing of people in Syria continue to take place, unfortunately. And they save time for themselves. And then they will come up with a very simple resolution, very simple proposal. Let's have free and fair elections. Do Syrian people want that?
Yeah, I just want to kind of.
I don't want just this story to finish this way and thousands of people already killed. But it could be. It could end up with this.
Russia's position is that it doesn't want to. It's not its role to tell another sovereign state how to behave, what to do. We don't want to meddle in Syria's affairs. How much of that is down to Russia's geopolitical interests? And it's an excuse. Effectively, Syria is a friendly government in an area where there's maybe a lot of American influence, and therefore, in old Cold War terms, that Syria is Russia's sphere of influence.
You very correctly mentioned just, I would say, the spirit of Cold War. In fact, we remember that when even last century, or better to say 3 centuries ago, the main value in the world was sovereignty. Today we live in the 21st century. And a number of special treaties have been signed, and Russia is participating country of all of them, including OSCE, so-called Organization Treaty of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and also Council of Europe, where just the priority of human rights is considered to be a priority number one. That's international treaty. Therefore, human rights and political freedoms today is not a sovereign issue of any nation, of any state. That's an international issue. And we're all obliged to follow and to check how all governments implement this main value. Mr. Putin decides to live in the old centuries, even 2 centuries ago, when sovereignty was the most untouchable point. So allowing dictators killing people every day, but not to touch the sovereignty of the state. That is the issue. And that's what the whole policy is built up on that. It happened, that such a reaction of Russian authorities happened when we had Egyptian developments and also in Libya. Now, third country comes, and Assad. And some people in Moscow could even measure such development for future for themselves. That is the issue which is a main motivation.
Rolla, let me come to you, because as I said in the introduction, you've been in and out of Syria a number of times as a doctor trying to make a difference. We're going to play a clip from that Panorama program in just a moment, but I want you to set the scene for us of where you were, how long you'd been there and what you saw.
So on this particular trip, I'd been in North Syria for about 8 days and working with a charity called Hand in Hand for Syria, a UK-registered charity. And we'd been to visit the site of another hospital that we run in North Syria and delivering some of our humanitarian food work. And then travelled to one hospital set up by Hand in Hand. And we were working in the emergency department when a baby, a 7-month-old, came in with 80% burns with his dad, who also had a burnt face. And we thought it was an isolated case. He was telling us about how a plane had flown over their house and suddenly his house caught fire. So we were dealing with the baby thinking it was a case in isolation. And suddenly, within literally a few minutes, we were inundated with many severely burnt teenagers who'd come in saying that their school had just been attacked by the same airplane, by the same incendiary weapon as the father and his baby. And so we ended up in a kind of a mass casualty event where a very small team of doctors and nurses working in a makeshift hospital were trying to deal with about 40 injured teenagers and family members that arrived all within about half an hour.
I said we'll play a clip in a moment. I just want to ask you, was there anything in your training that ever prepares you for dealing with something like that?
Your training prepares you for how to resuscitate patients and how to manage an acute emergency like that. It doesn't train you to comprehend how someone, a fellow human being made of flesh and blood, had just flown above a school and knowingly seen a bunch of school children standing in the yard and pressed a button that will end in killing them. That training doesn't explain to me how that could happen.
Okay. I'm going to play a clip from the film now. I should warn you that it is, as you might expect, somewhat distressing and somewhat harrowing. But this is a clip from Ian Pannell's Panorama programme.
13-year-old Ahmed is in shock. He's one of the youngest victims to come in. The emergency ward's full, so he's told to wait in the corridor. Within minutes, the hospital is overwhelmed.
He looks like he's about 13, 14 or 15. He's just a kid.
How will you treat it? How will you treat it? Nothing?
With their emergency experience, Roller and Saleha take charge. dealing with the most serious cases.
Let me do that. Get an IV line in him if you can. مغيرة بدك تطلع لي كل المرافقين لبرا. كل المرافقين يطلعوا لبرا. مين الأكسجين؟ جيب لي هالمونيتور.
خطوني خطوني خطوني
How are we doing with the painkillers?
خطوني
شوي.
No, he's already tubed, it's fine. He needs someone to be supporting his airway.
We can do first aid, we can provide analgesia, and any resuscitation required, but no specific treatment.
Well, it's hard to know where to go with that. I mean, other than, I want to salute you as well, just for the amazing work that you're doing, and and being bold enough to go there. I guess part of what you must wish, almost crave, is that the politicians and the policymakers would go and see it with their own eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think seeing is believing, because I think there's almost a level of disbelief amongst some of the public and some in government about the atrocities that are happening. It's almost like when you say, there's like innocent people actually being targeted, civilians are being targeted and slaughtered, really not very far away from here, with every sort of weaponry known to man, where kids are being killed in their schools, where kids are being arrested, they're being tortured, they're being sexually abused in their millions. We're not talking about small numbers of kids who are being affected here. People don't seem to believe that is happening, or certainly, and if there is a belief, then there doesn't seem to be a translation of that into action.
Do you think that, I hesitate to use the word we, policymakers, opinion formers, whatever, the commentariat, inadvertently, not condoning, but turning a blind eye to what is happening?
Oh, absolutely. I think the international community has, by and large, stood by rather than stood up for the rights of the Syrian people. I think that, unfortunately, policymakers, Security Council, and its member states have sought their own geopolitical and financial gains rather than looking after the rights of the Syrian people. This was never from the beginning, and remains the case now, that this was about protection of civilians or human rights, or the humanitarian catastrophe that's happening in Syria or the area. This has unfortunately always been about the politics of it, and it's why we find ourselves nearly 3 years down the line with absolute inaction, and allowing the slaughter to continue.
Mark, let me come to you now and pick up on on the area of public policy and what the international community can do, particularly when it comes to protecting children. Has everything been done that could be done?
No. I think this confusion about the scale of what's happening, the range of things that have been done to civilians, has sort of just people just can't get their minds and imagination around it, or policymakers can't. So instead there's a kind of narrative of atrocities on both sides, the complexity, intervention's been rejected, a political solution is not easy. And so the story doesn't have the kind of ending people want, to give it a rhythm, to kind of go through our nightly news and end well, or end. And so in that sense, first people have to accept the scale of what is happening. Genocide is not the absolute number killed. It's, in this case, the willingness of a government, and in some cases militias on the other side, to completely indiscriminately kill civilians, to not just target children, but to target doctors, as we've heard, to target schools, to target mosques, to try and conduct a kind of psychological war of intimidation against the opponents that goes way beyond just straightforward violence. And when it comes to violence, to, even without chemical weapons, to indiscriminately attack civilian areas. And finally, to, I think, what we really have to recognize, to now use humanitarian means to tighten the noose on people, to prevent food, healthcare going into people, so that, the New York Times is now claiming that maybe over this winter, as many lives will be lost from the humanitarian as has been lost from violence. In other words, another 100,000 lives.
Are you saying humanitarian aid is almost being used as a weapon?
It is being used as a weapon. Syria is under siege from its own government. And I think one always has to add that bit, and by some of the militias on the other side. I mean, that's what makes it complicated. But people are ruthlessly exploiting every means to win this war. And in that sense, it has become a genocide.
And that's a very strong word to use. We've seen an agreement over chemical weapons and their destruction. We heard Michael talking about that just a moment ago. Should that be a source of encouragement for us or a source of concern? Because it means that people start to think, oh, well, problem sorted.
Well, look, I mean, you see those pictures and you can only be relieved that chemical weapons have been taken off the table as a weapon. But, the problem is, it is illusory. I mean, it's given the impression to people, combined with there not being photographers and journalists there, that somehow the conflict has peaked. The fact is, more people are losing their lives now than when the chemical weapons were used, because the violence itself has intensified. This use of the humanitarian noose on civilian populations, with several million people essentially being besieged, denied access to food and medicines, mean more lives are being lost now, and that is not resonating, heard, or being responded to by the international community.
So the agreement is a cover for ongoing crimes?
Well, it's not a cover, but it's become part excuse, but it's the sort of misleading consequence of agreeing on something. The fact that, it's sort of given the government a sense that, it's kind of got a foot back into the diplomatic mainstream. It's been a partner to a negotiation. And also the fact it's seen that the West is not willing to intervene, that it was the West what blinked, so to speak, has, made it redouble its efforts to prevail militarily. And the rebels, similarly, suddenly realizing they're alone, that the West ain't there for them, has redoubled their efforts to prevail. And so the intensity of conflict, far from being reduced by the chemical weapons agreement, has been prompted into a whole new gear.
I just want to kind of open this up now to all of you. I mean, one thing we haven't yet discussed and haven't even mentioned is that it was announced this week that there would be a peace conference in Geneva on January the 22nd. Should we hold out hope?
Well, I think we have to hope. We can't give up hope, and it's easy to despair. So that must be a glimmer of hope. And I think we have to work for that peace agreement. But on the current track record, you can't hope an enormous amount, given the current situation in Syria. And as Mark has said, and as we've heard so eloquently from other people on the panel and so emotionally, the level of violence is increasing on the ground. But we do need a peace deal. I mean, there were moments during the Bosnia conflict, there were moments during other conflicts where we never thought we would see a solution, and we did finally get there. So we have to work for that. But I think in a way, all of our message is also something slightly different, which is in the midst of all of this, there's also something we can do. And it's to stop what we've just seen on our television screens. It's to stop children being killed, to make sure that these children and families in besieged cities get some aid. And I think Mark's point about the chemical weapons is very important, because actually when the world came together on the chemical weapons resolution, it did make progress. Why can't we have the same commitment on humanitarian access?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Maybe it's too much to hope, to dream that there could be a peace agreement, but maybe it is possible that there could be some kind of minimal agreement that will allow humanitarian aid to get through. Do you think that's possible, or more likely?
It is possible, and I mean, and the world actually did agree this. The Security Council, not a resolution, a weaker version of a resolution. It's called a statement, was agreed on October the 2nd, which actually, if you read it, is very powerful in what it says. It does say there can be cross-border operations, cross-conflict line, that soldiers and militias should leave schools. It does talk about all the right things, but there's no muscle behind it. I mean, I feel quite angry with the members of the Security Council, actually not just Russia, though you can be angry with Russia too, but America engaged on the chemical weapons resolution intensely. It didn't really do a lot before that, and since then it's done nothing. And I think we have to hold the Security Council's feet to the fire, all the members, to actually demand the implementation of this Security Council statement. And the United Nations also needs to step up to the mark. I mean, they are the moral body of the world. Why aren't they operating in a more robust and ambitious way to get aid into Syria across borders and across conflict lines?
Rala Halam, do you think that the aid agencies themselves are doing enough to alleviate the suffering? Or do you think it's impossible for them?
So I think, as a Syrian and sort of working with some of the Syrian organizations, our challenges have gone through different phases. So initially, and maybe up until now still, we have the better access. We've got good networks on the ground, colleagues that we have known for years who are able to work with. And so we're able to access very hard to reach areas, not the besieged areas though, that other big agencies aren't able to access. One of my frustrations has been that only until recently has there been much advocacy or much from the point of view of speaking about the atrocities that have been happening. And at times, and for a long time, it felt like we were sort of screaming in a vacuum, saying, like, this is a crisis and this is escalating at a really rapid rate and you need to all be doing a lot more. And for a very long time, it just seemed like no one really was listening. And then the other frustration is with the fact that even though the Syrian agencies are providing or organizations providing a lot of the aid, we don't have access to the funding that the large agencies or organizations have. So we get told by DFID and other funders, no, go, we're giving our money to the United Nations agencies and other big NGOs. You'll have to work with them if you want to work with them. So we go and knock on doors. And to give you an example, it took us 7 months to partner up with one international NGO so that we could be their implementing partner on the ground. 7 months in a rapidly evolving situation. And then when we said we wanted to do a project in Homs and in Damascus, we were told that we can't do that because the funders want the international NGO to monitor the distribution of the funds themselves. So we had to have it in the very north of Syria, i.e. not where the greatest need was, which breaks one of the biggest tenets of humanitarian aid, which is go where the need is.
I think this is a really big challenge. I mean, if we look at, and when the history is written of this, I think we'll see that an enormous amount of aid for Syria has gone into some particular areas, mainly through Damascus, mainly through the United Nations, and a few NGOs who have permission to work on one side of the conflict. For a long time, small NGOs, Syrian groups, and a few international NGOs have also tried to come in across borders. But we, even as an international NGO, one of the biggest in the world, couldn't get any European funding for that work. We had to use our own reserves because it wasn't legitimate that we were coming across the border from Turkey. Now that's improved. The British government, the European Union and others are now funding those kind of operations that we as an international NGO, including funding partners, are doing in Syria. But it's been, I do think it is quite scandalous that it's taken so long, as Rollo said, for the international community to make sure that aid is going throughout Syria. Because what Mark is saying is completely right, is that aid is being used as a weapon in this war. And if we have to get aid to all people in need, regardless of what side they're on, based on humanitarian need, we must keep that aid impartiality.
Mikhail, I just want to ask you about the January the 22nd talks in Geneva. I mean, Putin seems to be on a bit of a roll at the moment. Things are going very nicely in the diplomatic world of Vladimir Putin. He's, pulled off a number of kind of coups and agreements. I just wonder whether you think there might something come out of it.
As was correctly said, just not only Putin creates problems. Yeah. There are some other aspects too. I agree that chemical weapons destroyment, an agreement on that, should not be used as a cover for all other things. As we have just mentioned, just access of humanitarian assistance to remote areas, not under Damascus control, but where just really people need it. That's what should be the pressing point issue. But Geneva II conference, that's hope. That's why we welcome this and the agreement to have this conference. The problem is just who will be sitting around just at the round table. Whether Syrian people agree that this regime, which 21st of August used chemical weapons and thousands of people were killed, just now improved his image, and now just could be accepted as a normality. I don't think so. That's why just criticism is going on other countries and permanent member of Security Council by Russian authorities, that why you don't allow Assad sitting, or his representative sitting at this table. Well, I can hardly imagine how it could happen.
Mark.
Well, look, I mean, you know, it's been clear from the beginning that one way or another, the Assad government needs to be represented at that table. I mean, I think one day this war will end because people sit round a table and make a political compromise. This is not Libya, it's not Iraq, it's not a handful of beleaguered clansmen and presidential guards around an isolated leader. One's got to accept that for better or worse, fairer or less, that probably 40% of the population still support Assad. It is a coalition of minorities worried at what will happen to themselves personally and to their families and to their interests if the opposition prevail. And in that situation of a fairly equally divided country, you know, the only way you solve it is through a compromise, a negotiation between the two sides. One day it must end that way, but is it ready to do so on January 22nd? I rather doubt, because, you know, Assad still thinks he can hold on, and it is absolutely clear that a transition government which is going to have legitimacy and the support of everybody, he can't be in it, he's got to be gone. But similarly, you know, you've got 2,000 now rebel groups of different kinds, of whom a very significant number don't accept negotiation, who still want to prevail. So
I agree that people who continue to support just current regime should be represented at that conference.
Yes.
But there is an emotional aspect, and which is being used right now by politicians, just on setting up the participants of this conference. But the peaceful solution absolutely necessary, but again, it should not be used as a cover for all those killings which continue to take place there.
That's right.
I just want to, before I open it up to the floor, I just want to read you this quote that's been given to us by Archbishop Desmond Tutu on behalf of the elders. And he wrote, "Where is the ethical leadership in the Syria crisis? Why is it that any initiative which should ease the pain of Syrians seems so grindingly slow to take hold in the minds of our leaders, let alone be implemented?" Paul, you must feel that very intense.
Absolutely. The United Nations, the world's politicians have effectively, let's not beat about the bush, not wanted to get their fingers and toes into this Syrian crisis. We've seen the worst abdication of responsibility, of care, of compassion, of humanity. Since the very first day the Syrian army opened fire on innocent civilians, the world has looked the other way. Let's get that out the way. That has been the case. Geneva II and the chemical weapons talks. Firstly, the chemical weapons deal, a cynical ploy by all countries involved just to be seen to be doing something. The fact that they think they can take out 1,000 tons of chemicals from a hostile zone like that is pathetic. The fact that they've been seen to do something gives them all a little pat on the back and they can run off. Who is going to go to Geneva from the Syrian opposition and sit down with the people who have slaughtered their people? Who is going to sit down and then go back to Syria and say, listen guys, I've made a deal, that involves Assad. That person is going to be out of a job quicker than you can say Jack Flash.
Okay, we're going to open the debate up now to the floor, and we want to hear your opinions as well. Yeah, hang on. Yeah, we're going to get there in a minute. I've got a couple of housekeeping announcements to make before we can get to that point. Just to say also, if you are online, do post your comments and questions using the hashtag IQ2Syria, and Ash, our web host, who's working very diligently in the front row, will bring those comments to you in a few moments' time. It'd be great when you ask a question if you keep it brief. So I don't want speeches, I just want a question, and I'm not going to bring every panellist in for every question because that just eats time. So I ask you, because I will cut you off if it gets long and rambling. We've probably got one less microphone than we were going to have because I've got one of the microphones here as a result. So there's a gentleman on the end of the corridor. Yeah, there's a microphone winging its way to you, sir. Look to your right. Look to your right. There's a microphone there. So, yeah, give it to the gentleman there. Yeah, go on.
How should the world have serious children? The amazing thing is, the Arab region contains 22 countries. There are about 56 odd Muslim countries in the world who are all going on about Islamophobia and all that. There is not a peace brigade amongst a single entity amongst them. What a shameful thing. And then they're going to the international community, mainly Britain and the United States, to try and create this international consensus about peace building in Syria. I mean, what does it say about so-called Muslims and Arabs? Isn't there a sort of pope or a bishop amongst Muslims who can speak out about this? By the way, I'm Muslim myself. You know, it just condemns this entity completely, does it not?
Okay.
That they can't even protect their own kids.
Right, I'm going to take another question from the gentleman behind, and then we're going to put the microphone. There's a gentleman who's already got the mic. No, he's got a microphone. Come back to me. The gentleman in front there with the beard, in front of the gentleman who just asked the question. Yes, we're there. Right,
Hi.
Sir.
Yes, it's a question for...
No. Let the guy behind ask the question first. You're next.
I'm next.
It's like planes coming into land at Heathrow Airport. You've got to wait your turn. It would be good if you could stand up. Actually, I'm being told, stand up, and then on the sound desk, they'll know where somebody is.
My question is a very simple one. Does the panel, with everything that's been discussed and I've considered, does it support Western military intervention to try and bring the conflict to an end?
Right, OK, I'm going to pause there and pick up those questions. Mark Mallock-Brown, first of all, on military intervention.
Well, look, I think the analogous situation is 20 years ago, Bosnia, where everybody was against intervention because it was felt it would worsen the situation in Sarajevo and Srebrenica, better to get a little aid in. And then we realized that people were being just killed in front of us. And finally, it took intervention to stop that. I have been against intervention in Syria because I felt it would escalate the loss of life, and I didn't see a route to bring it to an end. But I am really alarmed that it's now completely off the table, because without that big stick threat behind diplomacy, I fear it's very, very hard to galvanize a serious diplomatic effort to arrive at peace. So I would like it in the quiver as an arrow that might need to be used if this thing escalates out of control, but not as the instant response. This still needs a diplomatic solution, if possible.
Just anyone on the panel, do you support military intervention?
Of course, everyone wants peaceful solution. But again, what we have Mark just explained, people already forgotten about, people in Syria, regime, forgotten about such a danger, such a pressure. But the resolution of United Nations of Security Council, just even right now interpreted differently by different members of Security Council.
And what about...
I think that should be some kind of clear interpretation that if the conditions not implemented, enforcement should take place.
I think the key thing is we're not going to have military intervention. I mean, I think, for whatever reason, whether you're for or against it, it is not going to happen. I think the key issue, are we going to have intervention? And it's got to be political, it's got to be organised across the world, and it's got to be focused both on the peace talks and pushing people to get to that stage where we can end this conflict, but it's also got to be around humanitarian access. And I think the most frustrating thing It's a lack of activity amongst members of the Security Council to try and make progress. I don't think anybody... I did a paper review a few weeks ago on the Andrew Marshall, and I wanted to talk about Syria, and just to reinforce, but I couldn't find one story in any newspaper on a Sunday 2 weeks ago to be able to use as an excuse to talk about the Syria crisis. And that's what nobody's talking about it in the capitals either of a number of members of the Security Council, and that's appalling given what we've just heard and seen.
There was a question about whether the Muslim world has failed to give leadership on this. I mean, presumably part of the problem is that the Muslim world is not united over what the solution should be.
I think the Muslim world's split into two halves. You know, we've got the Saudis, Qataris back in one section, we've got the Iranians, different groups back in Hezbollah. You know, the Muslim world is split into it. It's no surprise that the Muslim world is any more coordinated and together than the shambles that the Western world have been. I think the whole thing is a disorganized mess.
Okay. My mic is working, as you can tell. We've got some problems with some other mics. I think we've got one mic working in the audience. Yes, so you've got it. More hands, and I'll come and be a mic basher myself. Come on. Right. Sorry. Yeah, go on.
So I wanted to ask Dr. Hallam. The logo of the charity Hand in Hand for Syria is very clearly based on the flag of the Syrian opposition. And I just wondered if that denotes an affiliation of any kind. And also, is it correct that your father is Dr. Musa al-Kurdi, who's a member of the Syrian National Council, a fairly senior member? And also, there are many discrepancies in the video, which we saw some of. For example, some odd things. It is public knowledge that the audio soundtrack of your reports was altered from napalm to chemical weapon between two BBC reports of 29th of August and 30th of September. And in this report, I'll just focus on one.
Okay, I'll tell you what, you've made a number of points, and it could take all evening to answer them. So, right.
So some things you said are correct. My dad is called Musa al-Kurdi, but I'm afraid to say everything else you said is not as correct as that. He's certainly not a member of the Syrian National Council. He is a gynecologist. And who, like most Syrians, has taken an interest in what's happening in his country. What you refer to in the audio is, I think, what it is commonly done in editing. I said everything that you heard on the program. You just heard different sections of it in different times. And I'm sure if you contact the BBC, they will gladly explain it to you.
And also, we got flayed before in the past for not correctly representing sound and cheating the sound. I wasn't part of the Panorama edit. I am absolutely convinced that did not happen. Right, gentleman here.
Hi, for those of the panel who spent time on the ground in Syria, what is it that the Syrian people really want?
The Syrian people this whole thing started not when the Syrian people decided to have an armed insurrection. That was never the case. The Syrian people went out on the streets in peaceful protest. They weren't calling for the downfall of Assad or a regime change. It was quite simply the Arab Spring sprung, so to speak. And the Syrian people went out there peacefully. I spoke to the very first group of soldiers who fired on civilians. I was actually with them, and they told me they opened fire on civilians. But they also told me that if they didn't open fire on civilians, the rest of their friends who didn't were shot dead by a sniper from the government security forces behind them. The FSA was born of a need to protect people from the regime forces. The FSA didn't start thinking, we're going to war. They rode around, and I was there with them as they went to demonstrations and just kept an eye out to protect people. What the Syrian people want is a fair, balanced, some people may call it democracy, although we've seen that can't be imposed on people. If people have the desire for it, it can work. Can't work when you've got people like the Russians supplying vast, huge amounts of ammunition. You know, if anybody was serious about stopping people getting killed, they'd have cut off the arms supply from Russia 2 years ago. And a lot of people would still be alive today. All this fancy peace talks in Geneva and chemical weapons nonsense isn't going to save a life. Cutting off the ammunition years ago would have saved a lot of lives. The people want democracy, freedom, and away from the tyranny.
Rolla, is it a simple question to answer? What do the people want?
I think certainly the initial calls were for freedom and dignity. It was about human rights and the chance to live a fairer life. I think people now just want the violence to end. When I was there a couple of months ago, and all of the story about is there going to be military intervention by the US and the UK were there. And people were just so tired of living under constant shelling. Everyone was just like, if the Americans are going to come and bomb us to make it stop, then let's do it. You know, there's people are so desperate for the shelling to stop, so people want peace.
All right, I'm going to bring in two more questions. Gentleman there, and then the lady here. So we'll just take, sir, if you could ask your question.
Hi there. Given this is essentially a zero-sum game from the perspective of the Syrian regime, are there any realistic incentives, political or economic incentives, that can be offered on the table to the Syrian regime? And given that there is indifference and selfish interests among the international community at large, slightly pragmatic, but can any economic or political incentives be created for the international community to intervene?
Hi. I think the implication that the British government is indifferent or hasn't acted is a bit simplistic. Whatever you think of their action, they've given £500 million. They've given more money to the Syria humanitarian response than all the other EU states put together. They've taken an early position on the conflict. They've played a relatively active role in trying to influence the Security Council. So given that, what more should the British government be doing?
Okay, Justin, why don't you pick up with that thought?
I don't think actually any of us mentioned the British government so far, specifically. I mentioned Russia and America. I think you're right, though, that the British government has shown more leadership than many other members of the Security Council. I think particularly on the humanitarian aid, it's been early and it's also been on a huge scale, and a lot of the operations on the ground now in Syria, though not in the early stages, I think Rolla's right, DFID weren't funding aid into Syria in those first phases other than through the United Nations, which was more on the Damascus side, was problematic. But that's changed, and the United Kingdom has shown a leadership role. I think also at the G20 John was at and covering, the Prime Minister also showed a lot of leadership on humanitarian access and has pushed a lot for this UN Security Council on access. So I agree. I think the British government has shown a lot more leadership than other governments. But I think as a whole, I think the world has failed Syria. And I think since the chemical weapons resolution, which has sucked up so much political energy, we haven't seen the level of political engagement and diplomatic activity. And again now with Iran, it's all gone in another direction. Now you can say those things will open doors and it might come back round again, and we have these peace talks. But I think it feels very frustrating for all of our colleagues on the ground in Syria and the people of Syria waiting for this political energy to come.
Mark.
Yeah, 2 points. The gentleman who asked the question, is it a asserted it's a zero-sum game for the regime? Well, the answer is we must make it not a zero-sum game for the regime. The people it represents, Alawites and other minorities, must feel there is protected space for them in a new Syria. And that's the point of negotiation. There cannot be recrimination, retribution against these groups because of their lousy leaders. And so we've got to make sure that's part of the settlement. But the second bit is this settlement, or is in the future, intervention, as Justin has honestly said, is unlikely. So what we've got to do tonight is work out that given those facts, rather than walking away and saying this is too impossible, we have to say, how can we make the humanitarian response work so that the people of Syria get some relief, some security, some protection, some life, despite the horrific conflict boiling around them? And that's really the message here, which is governments have fallen into the trap we're in danger of doing in this conversation. The politics, the intervention, it's all too complicated. So what can we do but give up? The answer is, if we could make the humanitarian work, that could be the first step towards a political solution. Because if people get helped and it needs collaboration between communities to make that happen, then we can start to rebuild the bonds which held this diverse mosaic of a country together for a very long time, despite its horrible government. We've got to rebuild trust amongst peoples.
Mikhail, I don't know whether you want to come in very briefly.
Yes,
So,
I think now on this stage, the most important thing, I can completely agree, humanitarian assistance and access so that no barriers will be built up by Syrian regime. And the pressure should be every day by all groups of people and the political groups. And secondly, of course, negotiations, but for the regime, it's only the exit strategy. Not more than that. For new government, the comprehensive solution, comprehensive package by international community, how to build up devastated state and how just help them to start running economy.
Right, Ash, let me come to you because you've been our web host for the evening. I just wonder what sort of comments you've been getting.
John, thank you. Yeah, there's been lots of interaction online, as you'd expect. There's been words of support from Stephen Fry and Eddie Izzard, among others. Most people are really frustrated at the lack of awareness, particularly in the media, about what's actually happening in Syria beyond the chemical weapons agreements. There's been a lot of admiration for Roller's work in Syria and a lot of appreciation for Paul saying it like it is, and with the raw truth about the strategic approach to targeting children. There's been a couple of questions. What can be suggested for ongoing change in the world to make this kind of bloodlust insanity less likely in the future?
I really think that we have to look at the structures that we've got in place now. The United Nations Security Council is a hangover from another era. As we were talking about, it's a Cold War setup. You know, we've always got the situation where the veto is wielded by one of the, and it generally splits down two halves. We have a 3 and a 2. China and Russia tend to veto anything that prevents progress. They have done so throughout the Syria conflict. Maybe it's time we looked at taking away the veto and did it by majority rule, in which case we could actually stop this blockage that every time somebody comes up with anything feasible, it hits the Security Council, the vetoes are used, and we're back to square one. If we can get rid of that bottleneck.
I think one of the things that the Syria crisis has certainly shown me is that we do not have an international protection mechanism in place to protect innocent civilians. What we have is a whole load of international humanitarian laws and Geneva Conventions, et cetera, that are practically not worth the paper they are written on. Because unless you have got mechanisms to uphold them, so that when they are broken, there is a method to repair it, or when you've got force behind them, so that people know you are not to kill innocent civilians. That's what this has shown to me, is that we do not have that mechanism in place, and the United Nations has shown itself not capable and up to that task, and something needs to change.
Okay, Ash, quick final thoughts.
A specific question in relation to that from Antonio Suarez. Should we have a humanitarian corridor in Syria, and how could you police that?
Justin?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you define as a corridor. What I think we should have, and this is what most people understand to be a corridor, is we should have cross-border aid coming in from neighbouring countries to get into areas where currently 2.5 million people aren't getting any aid at all. Many people in besieged cities, even greater numbers, are not in the cities, but in areas that you can't get to. And we need to go across conflict lines, across borders. And actually, as I said earlier, the Security Council has agreed this. And I think if the Security Council has agreed this, surely we can now develop an operational plan to make it happen. But we're not. There's actually been no more progress since that Security Council statement was agreed. And as we've heard from Roland, the situation on the ground is increasingly desperate. I mean, we have a lot of staff on the ground. We work with a lot of partners. And in some areas of Syria, they're literally crawling across borders to get in. People are going into besieged cities with money on their backs and aid being carried in. It's something from Stalingrad during the Second World War. People are doing heroic things. I would just say to the gentleman around leadership and whether the big leaders are doing something in the Muslim community. What we do know is some ordinary Syrians are real heroes in this situation, are doing extraordinary things, many of them we've never heard of, to get aid to people in some of the most difficult circumstances in the world.
Can I just work on that? I mean, the main good thing about the binding resolution on the chemical weapons is that it has shown that when there is a political will there's a way of enacting change. And when you have got United Nations personnel in Syria being protected to carry out their work, why can't we put international aid staff under the same protection? Why can't they cross the borders, and why can't they cross conflict lines? It is possible, it's just there is no political will to do it. So it's that needs to change. It's not because it's not actually feasible.
I'm going to take a couple more questions. Gentleman there.
Thank you. I agree with everything that's been said, but I think the unfortunate thing about what happened in the last 12 months is the narrative has changed to a conflict between a thuggish criminal regime and extremist Islamist forces. I agree with Mark said. If the question is asked today, are you with the government or the opposition, you can argue it's 40, 60, 50, 50, 30, 70, it doesn't matter. But the question that should be asked to the people is, do you want to stop the killing, and do all the Syrian people want to live as dignified citizens, equal citizens, in a country where the Assad regime isn't there and the exclusionist, extremist Islamists are not there? The answer would be 99% yes. That's what people want in Syria. And that's what the international community should support.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And there's a woman who's got her hand up over there. I'm going to say this half of the room seems much more active than this half of the room. I don't know why. I'm going to go down there, and because I've seen someone I know, so I've got to ask. She's got to ask a question. Go on. Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Rula. Dr. Rula, the Syrian regime presents itself as a secular regime that protects women. You have been in the liberated north. What was it like there? Were you able to work, live, move safely?
No. There's really there's no place that's safe in Syria, unfortunately, and that comes in the form of various different problems. So there's the threat of violence, so that's mainly from either long-range artillery or from the very active air force that the government has for attacking the liberated north areas. So from that point of view, that there was those issues, and then there's an ongoing risk of kidnap from various militias and gangs who we don't know who they are. Some say they're Islamists, some say that they're paid thugs and gangs who kind of go and sell you off to someone. So there's that risk as well.
But do you think women have no option in the liberated north? Do you think they are radical Islamists who will not give an option to women?
I think there certainly are Islamists who are present there. I think their significance and numbers are being massively overblown by a media who I think has found a new angle to cover Syria with, and has therefore focused a lot on these jihadis and Islamist groups, and I think that significance is being overblown, certainly. I think that they are there, but I certainly was able to move around from that point of view normally.
Okay, one question here.
Yeah. Just following up on the whole question of the media. I mean, is part of the problem here that, and it's partly Paul, that the media can't get in? I mean, journalists can't get in now. So is it fatigue, or is it the fact that we actually can't get in to cover? And if we're talking about getting humanitarian aid in, which I agree with you must be the priority, is there any way in which we can actually get people in to report about this conflict? Because that is, to me, it seems to be part of the problem at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredibly difficult now. It always has been difficult to operate in Syria. I think at the moment there are 36 journalists, Western journalists, an untold number of civilian Syrian journalists missing. I can assure you that the 36 that is public is a lot lower than it is in reality. There are a lot of people who've been taken, journalists, where there's been a complete blackout for security reasons. So it is an incredibly difficult place to operate from. I think Ian Pennell's film with Rilla there was just an incredible piece of journalism where they went in. The risks they face going in were huge. The problem is when there's a void of information, that void is filled, and I think it has been overblown, the issue of ISIS and the level and the amount of jihadists, where it's got the situation now to, you know, politically, we can't intervene because now we would be arming jihadists. And it's muddied the waters. I went to a meeting a few weeks ago where it was said, let's face it, there are no good guys and no bad guys in this war. And that's not been good for the way people look at Syria now. It's swung from a brutal oppression of people to some kind of balanced, equal civil war, which it really isn't, but that is due in part to a lack of information coming out.
Okay, we've only got a few moments left in the debate, and I want to bring the panel back in on, frankly, what is our question for this evening's debate? How should the world protect Syria's children? I just want to almost get concluding thoughts from you. So, Rolla, why don't we come to you first of all?
I think in the broader sense, I'd like to see a movement by governments and policymakers to put in protection mechanisms in place in general for protection of civilians, like we were discussing. But on the specific issue of Syria, I think we need a binding United Nations resolution to allow humanitarian access cross borders and cross conflict lines, and that needs to be with immediate action. And I think that all those who have committed war crimes need to be referred to the International Criminal Court, an act that still hasn't happened despite the myriad of atrocities that have been reported. So those to me are two very clear action points that are very much doable if there was a will to do it.
Michael.
Again, we're in the 21st century. Responsibility of permanent members of Security Council should be reinforced in a sense that the main priority in the 21st century is human rights. In this respect, I think just future resolutions, which definitely will come soon on that aspect, on this issue, should be discussed in this manner. If it's not, it means just that those members who are not taking such a position as a priority of human rights, they simply jeopardize the whole structure of international settlements. And responsibility for stability of our permanent member of the Security Council is huge. It means we should build up something different. I'd like to believe that the human sense and just responsibility would play the appropriate role, and a real motivation would drive all those decisions rather than geopolitical, some kind of games, etc., etc. But the current situation, before such considerations, I think just pressure, public pressure on governments, so on every government, so that this pressure would be on a Syrian regime to let humanitarian assistance to take place on every corner of Syria as soon as possible, and just to create pressure so to stop killing. January 22nd, I think, just makes a great hope for all of us.
Okay, Justin.
I think firstly we shouldn't despair. We should redouble our efforts because the people of Syria need us to do that. Secondly, we should do what Rolla said, is that we need a Security Council resolution with the same force as the chemical weapons one, but on humanitarian access. And more importantly than the resolution, or as importantly, sorry, not more importantly, we need the plan to go with it. How many trucks are going into which city, what corridors across borders. It needs to be operationalized. And lastly, to be honest, we need all of you. We need a global campaign. We need the public to get angry. We need people to mobilize, like they did around the anti-apartheid movement, or when genocide happened in Rwanda. We need to get angry again. This is appalling what's happening in Syria. It is a challenge to our generation, and we need to stand up and be counted. And I hope all of you and all the people watching and listening will get involved and join us in trying to make sure the world does act to stand with the children of Syria.
Paul.
I agree with Justin. Cross-border access is the biggest commitment we could make now, the biggest actual real-term, short-term saviour of people. I think in the longer term, we've got to motivate. You know, it's like the world has been asleep for quite some time now, and I think it's time we woke up and looked at what these politicians, regimes, governmental organisations are actually doing very little except looking after themselves and not the Syrian people. I think it's very much being brushed away, and we should, as I think most people have said, make a very, very loud noise about the indifference.
And Mark Mallet-Brown, wind it up for us. Go on, give us...
Well, look, I think three options. The first is to get the Security Council to act, and my view is You know, the Russians always said, well, we're not supporting action because the West, it's always a thin end of the wedge for intervention. It's Libya, it's Iraq again. So my proposal to Putin is then you draft the resolution and challenge the West to support it and make it on the lines of this presidential statement, which does already say the right things. If that won't work, then challenge the UN Secretary General to do what we used to do, which is to say, if you'll forgive my language, bugger the Security Council. We're going to act under the principles of international humanitarian law, and we're going to take the food where the people need it. And the third option is, if you won't do that, is that NGOs like Save the Children and like Rollers Group, you know, organize their own land bridge and do it with the courage of the fact that Western and hopefully Russian and other public opinion is mobilized and behind them, and that the journalists are back. Because it's only when there's that kind of media and public opinion spotlight that NGO workers can go across a border, defying the armed soldiers on the other side, and deliver aid. It needs that kind of moral shield to do it. And just looking at you all and remembering 20 years ago on Bosnia, similar group of people, some rich people, some poor people, some students, some activists, people of all different political persuasions. It took an audience like this to start what we did to lift the siege of Sarajevo. We need to do it again. We need to mobilize, we need to tell our politicians to act, and if they won't act, we have to act through our NGOs and embarrass our political leaders to follow.
And with those passionate words from Lord Malloch Brown, we've reached the end of our discussion this evening. Thank you all for being here. And many thanks to our panel, Justin Forsyth, Dr. Rola Hallam, Mikhail Kazianov, Paul Conroy, and Lord Malloch Brown. The discussion is over, but the work doesn't stop here. And Save the Children have asked me to point this out and to say this, that Save the Children need your help to continue reaching those most in need. For those watching online, don't forget you can fill in your details on the live stream page. And for those of you here in the hall, on the back of your programmes, there's an action card to fill in if you can. Your help really does count, ladies and gentlemen. But from me, John Sopel, and all of us here in London, thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you.